Welcome and thank you all for coming today to the LLESA author speaker series featuring Sidney Niemeyer, the author of Atomic Peril, a nuclear forensics thriller. So this talk is being recorded today and it will be available on www.lesa.com. So today we're welcoming Sid Niemeyer. Sid began his scientific career at UC Berkeley with research in cosmochemistry and geochemistry. This led him to a career at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he spent 27 years serving in numerous leadership roles, including as the division leader of what was then known as the Nuclear Chemistry Division. So following the end of the Cold War, Sid found himself working in program development and articulating the need for the United States to develop a nuclear forensics capability to address the new reality of the post-Cold War world. In 1995, he chaired an international conference on nuclear smuggling and forensic analysis, and this led to the formation of the Nuclear Forensics International Technical Working Group, which we call now as ITWG. He co-chaired the ITWG for its first 12 years, giving it the culture and organizational structure that has served it well to this day. Moving forward a little bit, shortly after the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, immediately following the 9/11 attacks, Sid served for 3 years as a detailee focusing on rad nuke forensics. He also served on an attribution working group that was commissioned by the National Security Council, and this eventually led to the formation of the National Technical Nuclear Forensics Center. During this first year of the NTNFC, Sid served as its scientific advisor. So since retiring from Livermore in 2007, Sid has been a member of the NTNFC's Nuclear Forensic Science Panel, and he has participated in annual reviews of various U.S. nuclear forensics R&D programs, and he's also served on a number of Nuclear Forensic Science Panel subcommittees, providing special reports to the U.S. agencies on specific issues. So in 2019, Sid turned to his current career, embracing the challenge of writing a novel focusing on nuclear forensics. So the resulting product is this novel, Atomic Peril, which Sid will be talking about today. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Sid Niemeyer.
Thank you, Amy. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for coming to hear this talk. And for those of you online as well, appreciate you tuning in. Now, scientists, and I don't believe scientists very often actually write a novel, but what I think is even more unusual is for a scientist to see it as making a further contribution to their career, but that's how I view my novel. My aim in writing this book was to basically spread the word about what I see as the importance of nuclear forensics. I wanted to use this story to illustrate how nuclear forensics helps to respond and deter nuclear terrorism. But in hindsight, I also see a link between my scientific research and writing a novel, because they both require creativity. Now, maybe you don't think of yourself in doing science or research as being a creative, but you really are. Well, we often think of creatives as people who produce art. Here's a definition that I found about a creative. It's related to or involving the imagination or original ideas, especially in the production of an artistic work. And so that's how we usually think about it. And looking at a variety of definitions, they often would link a creative to advertising, which is yuck for me. I would hate to do that. But there's a connection. And I kind of want to bring that out in what I'm talking about, that when you're doing research, especially at the beginning, it involves creativity. After all, you're imagining that you want to discover something new or build something different. And the way you're going to accomplish that objective requires creativity on your part as well. If you did a thesis, you had to do original research. So you're being a creative in some aspect of your scientific work. Of course, there's a lot of grindingly routine detail that's involved as well. Amy mentioned my original research was in cosmochemistry, the study of meteorites to understand the origin of the solar system. And I can remember there was a lot of boring work involved after the early creative work, running a chemical separation column, loading a sample into a mass spec. Fortunately, when it comes to interpreting results, that requires some creativity. I just want to mention, because it relates to this book and my work in nuclear forensics, when you're doing meteorite research, you're basically picking a rock off the surface of the earth, and you're saying, what can I learn from this rock that fell out of the sky that will tell me something about how the solar system formed? You can think of it as kind of a cosmic forensics, and it requires a certain mindset to approach that kind of a problem. And many years later, when it kind of got going in the field of nuclear forensics, that kind of mindset played a very important role. In fact, I found that often cosmochemists or geochemists have the right kind of mindset to attack the problems we face in nuclear forensics. Well, there's this definition of being a creative, but I came across, one of the definitions had a line in it, a sentence, that really is going to be the theme of my talk today. And that is that change unleashes people's creative energy. And as I look back on my career, and I want to just sketch a little bit more of the background in terms of how change helped to unleash creative energy in my work and the work of my colleagues, and then talk about the creative challenges I faced in writing a novel, because that's rather different than doing science. Well, it really started for the laboratory and really for the U.S. in 1991. The Cold War had just ended, and Hans Mark came and gave a talk at the laboratory. Now, Hans had been formerly a Secretary of the Air Force, and at the time he was on an advisory board to the Secretary of the Department of Energy. And in this talk, he posed a new question. He asked, how quickly and with what certainty, if any, could we identify the origin of a nuclear weapon unclaimed by anyone? And this sparked the imagination of people in the crowd, in particular my division leader at the time, Carl Poppe. And so he used some of his internal funding to promote some study by scientists in his divisions to start to map out how would you approach answering this question. And of course, in our division, we did diagnostics of nuclear weapons. And I remember those scientists working on some of the scenarios they developed early on. And you know, they'd start with trying to answer this question, but soon they would kind of turn to their day jobs, diagnosing the performance, which wasn't the question they were asked. The question was, what can you do to help identify the origin of that weapon and the materials that it uses? A year later, I became the division leader of nuclear chemistry. 3 months after I became the division leader, the nuclear test ban took place. This was a huge change for my division. About 80% of our funding was from the nuclear weapons program. In the first 2 years I was division leader, that funding got cut in half. This was a huge change which unleashed the need for creative energy. What were we going to do? I recall when I interviewed for the job, for the role of division leader, I made the case that I believe we needed to change the culture of the division. Rather than just settling on our background and our assured funding in the weapons program, I needed to unleash the creative energies of the scientists in my division to envision new problems that they might be able to address with their capabilities. And I'm proud to say that many responded admirably, and we were able to replace all the funding that was cut in the next 2 years. Well, of the many new initiatives, the one I pursued most vigorously was nuclear forensics. Developed a whole bunch of different talks on this and gave many, many briefings. But I'll just let you know, we sent in many proposals to DOE over the next 10 years. None of them were funded. So that required some creativity on our part as well. Now, in my briefings, I emphasized that I believed it was important in developing this capability that not only we work with other national laboratories in the U.S., but we also needed to collaborate with others internationally. We couldn't do this alone. We had to collaborate with others. Well, one thing that helped us get notice for this new need, as I saw it, was there was a number of cases happening in the mid-90s in Europe. This is an example of just one case. Police in Germany were searching the home of a known criminal, And it wasn't for this at all, but they discovered this strange lead cask in his home. And they opened it up, and they found a vial with reddish powder in it. So the police didn't really know what to do with this, so they brought it to the laboratory at Karlsruhe. It's a European Commission lab that focused on safeguards, and so they figured, well, let's bring it to them. And so they did their investigation. They discovered that it was made to look like a well-known scam called red mercury, but within it, it had plutonium. And plutonium of a very unusual composition. It was almost impure 239. So this, and a number of other cases, started to heighten the sense of a need for how do we address this illicit trafficking that's taking place. Well, one of the officials in DOE that I had briefed a number of times, he was also a member of what was at the time called the Non-Proliferation Experts Group, or NPEG, of the G8. And at one of their meetings, he proposed that he would sponsor an international conference to address this problem of how do we combat illicit trafficking of nuclear materials. And unknown to me, I didn't know he was going to do this, he let me know that we should hold it at Lawrence Livermore, and he wanted me to be the chair of the program. So a huge change that happened. He wanted me to develop the agenda and promote kind of a widespread conversation. Now, the State Department helped us a lot in this. They sent out formal invitations to the G8 and former Soviet Union countries, and we were really gratified when the person who did that work in Germany at Karlsruhe agreed to come as well. So we had somebody who had actually had experience with working these cases. It was an unusual mix of people. We had about 70 people attend. Of course, you can't really see anybody in that picture, but it was an unusual mix of people. A lot of people commented they'd never been at a meeting like this because it involved just not scientists, but we had law enforcement and intelligence people and policy types, so a very unusual mix. Well, as the meeting came to an end, our State Department contact, Eva was her name, came to me and said, Sid, I want you to take all the technical people and come up with a proposal on how you can continue to do this type of international cooperation. Meanwhile, the rest of us are going to take a break and let us know when you're ready. And basically, when they came back, we came forward with a proposal to form this International Technical Working Group. And that launched this group that continues to be vibrant to this day. We really emphasized it being an informal group. But what gave it influence is all the countries that had significant capabilities that could be applied to nuclear forensics were a part of it. Now, there's an element of creativity that came in basically co-leading this group for the first 12 years. After the conference was done, Eva told me, she said, this is one of the most productive meetings I've ever been at. And by all means, don't let this become an official government activity because that will kill it. She said, it doesn't need to be mother may I when every step you're going to take. Don't let it be that. So here's how I interpret her words. Be creative. Go ahead, just push ahead and be creative and keep us informed. So it gave us that latitude, and probably it also meant that they didn't have to take responsibility if we screwed up. So the ITWG started. For the next 5 years, the work other than briefing in nuclear forensics was just giving these talks and briefings. But there was a couple things that happened in year 2000 that were critical. First was a seizure of highly enriched uranium that happened in Bulgaria. A smuggler was coming out of Turkey into Bulgaria, and they discovered the material that's found here. This has been briefed a lot, so I'm not going to talk about it really very much at all, except as how it relates to my book. We did find it had an enrichment in uranium-235. Some of the creativity I used in these early years is how would I fund research? And in the early 90s, I convinced my associate director at the time, Mike Anastasio, to use some of our dwindling test fund to actually sponsor some research on nuclear forensics. And what we focused on was age dating of nuclear materials, in particular plutonium. So when this case came along, we were well prepared. And we determined this age that's shown there with an accuracy of about 1 month. So the significance is this case provided a starting point for my book. Actually, I reference it in the book, but I give it a different location, saying it's in Romania rather than Bulgaria, but otherwise all the details are the same. But there's a second development that I want to highlight that played a significant role as well. Again, a change happened. Early in 2001, I transitioned into a brand new role at the laboratory, stepped down as division leader, and basically took a role of an assistant to the associate director. At the time it was NAI, basically the predecessor to global security. And basically I had the opportunity to just develop new initiatives, look around the directorate and see what new things we might do. But he immediately had one task for me. Wayne Schatz was the AD at that time, and he said, "Sid, I just signed up for this DoD task force, and it's going to study the unconventional nuclear threat." I said, what's an unconventional nuclear threat? Well, basically delivering a nuclear weapon by any means other than a missile or a military aircraft. And so he's told me, he says, "Sid, I'm on this committee." He said, "But you have the right experience with the things you've done as a division leader and your background. You're the right person to work on this. So basically, I want you to carry the ball for me," which meant I went to all the meetings and he showed up occasionally. But it was a great opportunity for me. Now, in the early years, after World War II, this threat received some attention. But by the 60s, when the focus was on developing our arsenal and the Russian arsenal, it faded into the background. But with the end of the Cold War, it started to again be viewed as something significant to address. So the way this task force works is you meet for about 6 months. You have various meetings to develop your ideas, your preliminary recommendations and findings. Nuclear forensics, I was new. I'd never done something like this before. Most of the people were much higher level than I was. So I basically just kept quiet, didn't push my own agenda. It was only near the end of the task force that the whole concept of nuclear forensics really took root. I would mention that Jay Davis, Livermore scientist, physicist, he did attend one of our meetings. He had just been appointed as the first director of DITRA, and he was one of the people who heard that talk by Hans Mark in 1991. And he informed us he planned to start a small start the next year in post-det nuclear forensics. Well, very near the end, the way these summer studies end is after your 6 months of meeting, you gather for 2 weeks, in this case at UC Irvine, and you develop a briefing that you're going to give to high-level people in the DoD, basically 4-star generals. So you spend 2 weeks doing dry run after dry run and developing it. And I had the element and I wrote the nuclear forensics recommendation and also another recommendation I won't talk about, it's not relevant here. And this was again during a coffee break. Roger Hagengruber, former Sandia director, he turned to me and said, "Sid, I need you to come up with a dollar number for how much we should ask for this new initiative in nuclear forensics." So everybody else took a coffee break, and I'm sitting there writing things down. It's like, okay, we got this thing we should do, we got this thing we should do, and came up with a rough number, and when they came back, he said, "Okay, Sid, how much?" And I said, $10 million a year, which sounded like a huge amount to me at that time. I mean, we've been operating on virtually nothing. And he said, "Are you sure that's right?" And I said, "Well, I think it's a great start." And I don't know if it's coincidence, but when the DITRA program began the next year, it was funded at $10 million a year. I thought, darn, I should have asked for more. I wasn't quite creative enough in that. I'm not going to go over this much, but this is our finding and recommendation, a summary of it, and we emphasize the importance of doing it accurately, having credibility, and quickly. And the recommendation is we had an ad hoc capability to do this, but we really needed to put it together and make investments to be able to do this credibly. I want to make another note regarding, and then we're going to get to the book soon here, but it all relates to the book, of the creative efforts regarding nuclear forensics. And that was, and Amy mentioned, at the start of DHS. But I want to give you a little of the backstory. There's a planning team, a transition team, to plan the science and technology arm of this new DHS. And the transition team came to Livermore and asked for help. And I and Junie Kamerad led an effort to develop our recommendations for what should be involved, what should be included in a nuclear counter-nuclear terrorism program. I have to tell you, I found that I appreciated looking at a blank sheet of paper and asking myself, what would I like to include? What do I think should be included in such a program? We came up with about a dozen different white papers that we wanted to write. We ended up tapping about 120 people at the laboratory to help write these white papers and submitted them to the transition team. Mike Carter had been corralled into this transition team, so he's my contact back in Washington. And he reported to me that the leader of the transition team, Parney Albright, liked all the white papers except one. He really didn't see nuclear forensics as being a fit with their program. And I responded, I hope politely, that I found that to be rather a bummer. And so Mike said, how about if I arrange a briefing with Parney? And Mike arranged that. And I really couldn't talk about R&D because not much had been done, so I briefed him on some of the work we did with the ITWG, including that Bulgarian case and linking it to another case. And then I gave Parney my elevator pitch. Now, maybe you're familiar with this, but I would suggest as a scientist, pour some creative energy into developing an effective elevator pitch for your proposals. Basically, the idea is in 30 seconds, say something that will grab the attention of the person in such a way that they'll want to do what you want them to do, that is, fund you. And so here's my elevator pitch to Parney. I said, Parney, I know you're intending to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into detector systems, hoping to see when nuclear materials are moving through an area. You know how hard that problem is. So what are you going to do when you're finally successful? Are you going to say, great, we succeeded, and walk away? Or instead, do you want to exploit that evidence that you've discovered to the full hill to understand where that material came, what's going on? I suggest that you leverage the hundreds of millions of dollars you're spending on detector systems by investing tens of millions in nuclear forensics. Parney immediately arranged for me to brief somebody in the White House, and a couple days later we got word that DHS would be funding a nuclear forensics program. Towards the end of my career, in 2006, 2007, I started to become more involved in the policy community. I want to talk about one thing because it relates directly to the book. We became aware, and there was starting to be some writing in the public about nuclear forensics, but all the focus was on the post-it scenario, after the mushroom cloud goes up. That's what galvanizes and creates attention. But we wanted to make the case that there's an important role for what we call pre-det nuclear forensics, before the explosion. So Dave Smith and I wrote this article for Arms Control Today. I have no idea how many people read that, but we basically made the case. It's important to investigate every case of illicit nuclear material until you're sure it's not important. That's the case we made. Well, this actually set me up for the book, because basically what I came to understand is the case I made in this probably forgotten and almost never read article, I made the case by telling a story. I realized that if I tell an engaging and entertaining story that makes the point through a story, rather than just telling people about it, but show the importance, the role of nuclear forensics, and how it can help deter or stop a nuclear terrorist, I did it through a story to make it engaging and entertaining. Now, writing a thriller is a very different creative endeavor, I have to admit, to doing scientific research or writing scientific articles. So I began going to writers' conferences to learn the craft and learn about this whole publishing world, which was, again, news to me. And the common advice you get and you learn at these writers' conferences is write about what you know. And, well, what I knew quite a bit about was nuclear forensics, so I thought that would be a good subject for a book. And I was painfully aware at that time, too, and how few people had even heard about this field. So I was hoping that by making an engaging, entertaining book, it might help to spread the word. So I tried to balance the educational element with the entertainment element. But as you might recognize, scientists tend to lean towards the educational side. And a lot of our briefings would attest to the fact that they're not very entertaining. So I took the key point from this article and made it a part of the book. That's the thrust of the book. But how do you actually go about learning the craft? We'll go into writers' conferences, but I want to just tell you a little bit that might help you and maybe inspire you someday to write your own book. How do you develop the plot? Well, I went to one writers' conference and told them I was a scientist who wanted to write a thriller, and they said, you ought to go talk to Randy over there, because he's a scientist too, and he's written a number of novels. So I went over and introduced myself to Randy, and he said, well, what kind of scientist are you? I said, well, I'm a physicist. And he said, oh, so am I. He says, well, where did you get your degree? And I said, Berkeley. And he said, oh, so did I. So Randy now had more interest in talking to me. And later I went to his talk on his method that he had developed for understanding, for writing a book. And he calls it the snowflake method. He said he actually got the kernel, he did his PhD in theoretical particle physics, quite different than nuclear forensics. But he said he got the kernel of the idea for this from his PhD thesis, but made it more simple. So here's how it actually works. You start, it's simple. You start with a one-line, one-sentence description of your entire book. Sounds simple, but it's hard. It's really hard to write a good sentence, one sentence that describes your whole book. Then you take that sentence and you expand it into a paragraph. Then you take each sentence in the paragraph and expand it into its own paragraph, and you just keep developing the complexity this way until you finally end up with a synopsis of your entire plot, much in the same way that a snowflake develops. So by the time I sat down to write my book, I actually had about an 8-page synopsis of the plot. So let me just tell you a little bit about my plot. You may have already read the back of the book, but the hero of the story is Stephen Carter, who, of course, just happens to be a scientist at Lawrence Livermore. Like I said, write about what you know. And he just happens to lead the best nuclear forensics team in the country, which, of course, happens to be true as well. So I'm writing about what I know. So anyhow, the FBI comes to Carter and asks him to analyze a small amount of HEU that was found in a smuggler in Moldova. And they discover after their initial analyses that it bears a striking resemblance to some cases in the past. Now, Stephen Carter, he argues that it's different enough that they shouldn't drop the case, but the FBI says, there's really nothing there. So they stop the case. They stop the investigation, tell them to stop analyzing the material. Now, Carter goes rogue, and he secretly continues doing his measurements, his analyses, and he discovers compelling evidence somebody has enough HEU to build a nuclear bomb. But he decides, I can't go back to the FBI. They'll just be so angry that I disobeyed their order, they won't even listen. So he takes it to the CIA. Person there listens to him, and eventually that leads to an interdicting apart at the border to the U.S., and then he reunites with his FBI handler, John Kittrick. I gave him that name. And together they explore and develop the clues buried in that HEU part to stop the nuclear catastrophe from happening. Now I want to make a point. By its very nature, trying to bring a nuclear weapon into the U.S. has to be a thriller. I like to write more suspense, but it has to be a thriller. But I want to say it's a science thriller. I tried to paint a realistic portrait of how scientists work and think in this field. So it's not science fiction, it's real science in a thriller. I did have to depart in a couple ways, though, from making it completely realistic. Because if I made it completely realistic, it would fail in the eyes of thriller readers. The first way I had to change is you have to constantly up the conflict and the tension. And that's why I had Stephen Carter go rogue, because that brings big conflict early on into the story. I had about 15 beta readers totally. 3 of them were nuclear forensic scientists at 3 different national laboratories. And they all came back to me and said, Sid, no way would a lab scientist disobey the direct order of the FBI. Maybe decades ago, a lab scientist might do that, but in today's world, never. But again, I did it because I needed to increase the tension. It brought a lot of conflict into the book, which is good when you're writing a thriller. Now, in the snowflake method, you take a similar approach for each major character. You write a one-sentence description of what their role is going to be in the story, and then you keep fleshing it out, like what's their main objective in this story, and what are the conflicts that they're going to encounter, and maybe they have an epiphany along the way. So I ended up writing a 1 to 2 page synopsis for each major character, and I found that by doing that, you introduce a lot of complexity and, again, conflict and interest in developing the story. Now, people have asked me, and you can ask more if you want, but are these characters based on actual people? And I would say the only person that's somewhat based on a real person is Stephen Carter, and based on me. And when people ask me, how much of this character is you, I would say, 50% or maybe a little bit more. And my stepson read the book. He hardly reads anything, but he read the book because he was intrigued in being able to talk to the author about it. And so he asked the same question. When I told him, half or maybe more so, he said, Sid, I noticed there's an awful lot of coffee and donuts in this book. And I had to admit that was true. So now I tell people that Stephen Carter is about 2/3 me. There's also another character that's a composite of 2 people. It's the woman who's basically the right-hand assistant to Stephen Carter. She's the one who keeps the group running efficiently. She's also the one that has a high EQ. And I based her on 2 women that I worked with. They were section leaders when I was a division leader, made it a composite, and so that helped me develop that character. Everybody else was just a product of my imagination, but it was influenced by my years here at the laboratory. I took one of the scientists on Carter's team and made him a little bit of what I would call an arrogant ass, which in my experience was not a stretch to find at the laboratory. One of the nuclear forensic scientists, he's actually in the audience today, read my book and he made the comment that the characters ring true. But I swear they're composites, not based on any single individual. I also decided to write chapters that gave the terrorists the point of view. Again, this took imagination. Putting myself in the shoes of how a terrorist would approach building their nuclear weapon and detonating it in a U.S. city. So that took imagination. But I would point out, if you're involved in a program where you're trying to counter our adversaries, it's a good idea to be able to have the creative imagination to put yourself in their shoes so you can understand how to respond to what they might do. One other departure that I made from what would happen in real life. And that is, in a thriller, the hero has to stay in the story to the very end. And they have to play a key role in helping to stop whatever bad thing is going to happen. Well, in the real world, Stephen Carter would just stay here at the laboratory, and the FBI would say, thank you very much for all the investigation, the work you've done, we'll take it from here. But that wasn't going to work for a thriller. So I had to come up, and I think I came up with a fairly plausible way to do this. I had his FBI, who kind of becomes his buddy, invent a special role for him. I call him the scientist profiler. And so he plays this role, and he's in time invited to join them in the search for the terrorist and the nuclear weapon before it's detonated. Basically, he becomes a field operative, and in that way I could keep him in the story to the very end. Just a couple more comments, and then we'll go to QA, but I want to make a couple more comments that might spark some questions on your part. I would say the scientific clues are central to the story. But of course, I would expect most of the people who read it are not technical people themselves. So my goal was to try and write the technical parts in such a way that a non-technical person could at least follow the logic flow, even if they didn't understand every detail. But I didn't want to write it in such a way that my scientific friends would say, why is Sid being so stupid in the way he's writing this? So I tried to navigate that, and my wife was a great help in this. She's a very intelligent person, but not at all technical. So she'd be my first reader, and I would get annotations back from her in the chapters I gave her, said, Sid, you need to dumb this down. So she was a big help in having me do that. Also in crafting a story, again, we need to ratchet up the conflict, and so I did that by developing some subplots that involve Stephen Carter's family. His work-life balance is a problem. He has a growing emotional distance with his wife, and he has a son that's going off the rails during the book. I had another beta reader who works here at the laboratory. He's a social friend, doesn't do anything in nuclear forensics, and some of his feedback was he related strongly to many of the issues faced by the characters, causing me to pause for moments of self-examination. Well, I believe I did succeed in writing both an education and entertaining book, and I'll just give you a few quotes here that I think helps to make the case. First is from Bill Deitch, who was the first director for 10 years of the National Technical Nuclear Forensics Center. He told me, turns out he's a huge fan of thrillers, and he found my book to be, what did he say, polished, gripping, and entertaining. He said if he was still director, he'd make every employee read my book. Too bad that didn't happen. Rick Acker, a person I know, a suspense author, said if you like Tom Clancy's book, you'll love this book because it is a techno-thriller. And then maybe some of you know Frank Wong. I didn't identify him here as belonging to the laboratory, though he does, but he served for several years in the National Security Council. And he wrote that he found it to be a fast-paced and intriguing techno-thriller, a tour de force of nuclear forensic science, and skillfully interweaves the so what of what the science tells us with other key information. So he said you're going to learn a lot and you won't be able to put it down. Now this last quote was from an Amazon reviewer. I don't know this person at all, so I don't know who he is. He wrote a very long review. I just abstracted a couple things. I'm trying to let you know that you might actually enjoy this book and some of your friends that aren't technical. He said, it's not common to find a thriller that meshes a riveting story with rock-solid science and real-world conditions. But Atomic Peril does this exceedingly well. I really enjoyed how the author wove Stephen's family into the story more and more as time goes on. The family crisis builds as the nuclear crisis builds. How can that possibly be dealt with? It's a very complex puzzle to solve that had this reader gritting his teeth, unable to put the book down during those last 100 pages. And with that, I have some other things I can talk about, but I'd rather turn it over to you and allow you to make comments or questions. Thank you much for your attention.
Testing. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I already read the book. Great book.
Oh, thank you.
So I guess I've got a lot of questions here in case no one else does, but
That's good.
one of the questions I have is, does Russia and U.S. cooperate? Because in your book, there was a level of cooperation required to find out the source of things.
Yes, I did put a little cooperation in there, and I didn't really specify the time frame of this book. It's kind of just contemporary time. So some of that might strike you as a little bit odd, but I think I would suggest in this kind of a case, and I tried to portray it in a way that they're hesitant at first because they're always worried you're trying to blame them. But I think when it becomes clear that we're not trying to blame them, we're just trying to understand, then they're willing to cooperate a little bit. But there's also, as you know, if you read the book, they threaten Stephen as well, and they question what his motives are in trying to. One thing I had to change, by the way, because of current circumstances in the earlier versions of the book, and by the way, the ITWG shows up in the book, again, trying to make it real world. But he goes, in the early version of the book, I have him go to Ukraine to try and understand where and what kind of Russian reactor might have produced this material. I had to change that to Kazakhstan because I didn't want to put it in people's faces that actually there's a Ukraine-Russian war going on now. So I just felt like I needed to ignore that whole issue. So thank you. Yes?
Writing is hard, and I appreciate the description about the snowflake method, but were there times when you just had a block, and how did you push through?
You know, I really didn't. I didn't really encounter writer's block. As I mentioned, like even developing the nuclear, I like a blank sheet. And kind of what intrigued me in doing this, and I didn't talk about, but how you write each chapter. And so it became a puzzle how to write each chapter or each scene. You got to start with establishing who the point of view character is, and they have to have a certain goal or objective. And then in that chapter, you're going to throw kind of obstacles and barriers in their way. They kind of somewhat overcome, but then end with a kind of a little cliffhanger so the reader wants to keep reading. But it kind of is a puzzle of how do you do that, continue to flesh out the characters, but move the story ahead. So I was always intrigued as I approached each chapter, how am I going to work the puzzle for this chapter and then fit all the puzzle pieces together? So that kept me intrigued. I did at times say to my wife, am I crazy to try and do something like this in my retirement years? Because it took me 4 years from the time I started writing to actually putting the book out. Yes?
Hi, a couple of practical questions, if you will, for the aspiring writers. First would be the levels and types of reviews that you had to go through, given what you were writing about and the clearances you've had. And then the second was the process for getting published, right? The publisher, the pitch.
Yeah.
For that.
So anyhow, I had a friend of the laboratory who's an ADC. So when I wrote a part, I mean, I was pretty sure I was staying clear of classification, but I had a part of the story when I was writing early on that was even close. I would send it to him, say, is this okay? A couple times he said, yeah, you're okay, but if you just change this a little bit, it'd be better. And so I would do that. And then before I actually put the book out, I went through the formal review and release. So it had been fully reviewed for classification. Let's see, the second question was, publishing. This is what, half of going to writers' conference is learning about the publishing business. And of course, it's changed so much with online publishing. And so there's a lot of learning in that. Every writer will say, that's not what I want to do. I just want to write. I don't want to be in the business. And they basically say, if you want people to read your work, you're kind of in a business too. So I did try to get the critical step these days, because most publishing houses, I could go on a lot about this, but it probably bore most people, but most publishing houses are really skinning down their staff. They have very few staff, so they basically rely upon literary agents to do their screening. So the goal is to get a literary agent. I tried to do that. I had actually one publisher who insisted he wanted to read my manuscript before I might self-publish, but I was not able to get an agent, so I went ahead and self-published. But the key in self-publishing is to get the right professional help to have you do it. For example, you see the cover. I did not create that cover. I do not have that skill. So there's basically various sites where you can go and have people bid on creating the cover for you, and then you work with them in producing it. And a lot of other things along the way. I also employed a freelance editor. She did 2 rounds. First, what they call a developmental edit, the kind of overall structure, characters, and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, a more detailed, what they call a line edit. And so I went through 2 rounds of editing by a professional who had done thrillers before, including some New York Times bestsellers. And so that was a huge help in learning the craft as well. Thank you.
Hello. So I did read the book. I absolutely loved it. So
Thank you.
looking a little bit to the future, can we expect another Stephen Carter story? And how much are we leaning into him as a profiler for that?
Yes. Well, thank you for the question. I did not put her up to it.
My check, I'll be waiting outside.
Yes, I am writing a second book. It is another nuclear forensics thriller. It involves many of the same characters. but they're in different positions. And if you've read the book, you'll find near the book they kind of moving and transitioning. I pick up on that 5 years later. Basically, I have completed a very rough draft of the second book. Completed that at the end of August, spending 2 months now to refine it and rewrite it, and then send it to my editor for the first edit. So yes, I am planning. It'll be a very different kind of case, so it won't be the same kind of case. When I told my classification reviewer what kind of case I plan to include in this book, he said, "You must really love a challenge, because it's going to push up a little bit more against classification, so I have to be very careful there." But yes, and I'm aiming to get it out by the end of 2025.
Quick question on, you were talking about your synopsis. I'm curious if in your writing process you get partway through and suddenly you realize, you want to know what, I need to scrap that part of the synopsis, and because it really doesn't make sense, and go a totally different direction or something.
In this book, I wouldn't say I went to a totally different direction, but there's certainly things I had to adjust as I went along. And my editor helped a lot in that. Like, she would say, this part just isn't working for me. I incorporated something in the mastermind terrorists. I included something in his storyline that she said, this just isn't working for me. And I listened to her and changed that. I wanted to force him to make a change in the design that would help in the whole story. So I did that, but I did it in a different way. Another thing I might mention, she pushed me, again, up the conflict. So I mentioned I had this guy who was kind of an arrogant person, and she said, you know, Sid, here's an idea. Why don't you make him somebody who actually cooperates with the terrorists, or maybe unwittingly assists them? And I had to say, okay, that's an interesting idea, but I was trying to write a book that's realistic about the work we do at the lab. I just could not bring myself to paint a lab scientist as somebody who's helping a terrorist. So I declined on that suggestion. Yes?
So you had a big barrier or activation energy to do the first book. Now you're doing the second book. What is easy, and then what are the hard parts of doing a second book?
The easy part is I've learned a fair amount about the craft. So writing the first draft was much quicker. I also found that I believe a big part of a book has to be dialogue, and that can be hard for people. But I think I developed and found I have a fair degree of skill for a novice in writing dialogue. And there's an art to writing dialogue in a book. You can't write it exactly the way people speak, because it won't work. You can't put the uhs and ahs and roundabout and repeating yourself and all that. So you need to write the dialogue in a way that the reader hears it as being authentic, but doesn't have all that other stuff that gets in the way. So I found that skill that I developed, and actually one of the things I do in revising the book, I read the entire book aloud to myself, so I can actually hear it and then make notes as I'm going along to change things.
So having written the book, then what's the process of publicizing it and selling it? And what platform do you primarily?
Yeah.
Or in what form? Is it electronic or actually printed?
Yes. I forgot to mention that. I mean, the book came out on Amazon last October. It's available in Kindle, paperback, and I had a professional do an audiobook as well. So if you have friends that prefer audiobooks, they can purchase that as well. Publicizing. The platform. And you go to a lot, what's your platform? And I decided, I'm kind of on Facebook, but not much. My main platform was to write a newsletter and get people to subscribe to the newsletter. And that's where I keep them updated on my progress and give them kind of background information that's relevant to the field. It's harder for a fiction writer to establish a platform. If you're doing nonfiction, there's people who are interested in your subject, and it's easier to get on podcasts. It's harder. But I would say the main thing has been reaching out to people that I know or I've met with that have an interest in this field, and people I know socially, and getting them to subscribe to the newsletter and then letting them know and get the word out. So it's a lot word of mouth, but it is hard because it's so easy to publish on Amazon these days. That means there's even far more books available than there used to be. So to get seen amongst the herd of books, somebody said, I forget how many thousand books come out like every day. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So this question is about how serious the threat is, and there might be several sub-questions here. It's like, one might be, how many times have nuclear materials tried to cross the border that we know of? Another might be, is even the waste from nuclear power plants potentially a problem?
Yeah.
And if so, should we be more careful about waste from nuclear power plants, and should we even be pushing power plants,
Right.
nuclear power plants?
Yeah. Well, I believe this is a serious threat. It's actually surprising to, and you know, I can't really comment on how many cases there have been and how many cases we stopped. I got asked, I did a launch party in downtown Pleasanton, and somebody asked, well, have you ever been involved in actually stopping a terrorist? And I said, well, as my wife often says, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. So it's kind of a common line. So I can't really comment on that, but I do think this is a serious threat. And the point is, and this is a key thing, I didn't mention it in the talk, it actually came out of the summer study, it's important to publicize that we have this nuclear forensic capability and give people the impression, if you try this, we're going to find you, without revealing all the details of what we actually do. So that was part of what I had to do in the book as well, is give enough, but I didn't want it to be a how-to-do manual for a terrorist, so I was trying to be careful with that as well.
Sid, I wanted to remind you that you talking about how you publicize and how you market this, you mentioned your launch team.
Yes, that was my wife prompting me. The one way I got it out is I had a launch team. That's somebody, and I actually took a course, a 1-month course called Blueprint for Launching. And so I had about 30 plus people that were on my launch team. And basically what they were willing to do was to read the book, to write a review, and encourage their friends and get the word out on social media, whatever they have available. So it helped spread that word that way. And I tried to find and got people from around the country, so it wasn't just our local area as well. So that's another way of doing the initial publicity. This published author, he said the best way to sell more books is write another book. Because if people find the second book and they never saw the first one, then they'll go back and read it. And that's why I don't want to go more than 2 years between writing books. I mean, the highly published and popular authors, they'll write 1 book a year because you got to keep people going back and reading it. So the best way to sell more books is to write another one, which isn't easy.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sid, for being here. Another round of applause for Sid.
Thank you. Thank you.